you for this opportunity, and it's great to be in the company again of young and aspiring conservationists and scientists. So why is science important? The first point I want to make is that science is forever evolving itself. It doesn't stay the same. And it's interesting that the original idea for science, developed over 1,000 years ago, was to develop methods to dominate and subdue nature for human benefit. And one can see that in the early writings of the Royal Society of London. And one also sees it in political speeches made centuries ago, and even in the main religious texts, which talk about us gaining dominion over nature. Of course, science always adjusts to the circumstances in which we live and addresses our most urgent needs. And the modern idea of science is it is our attempt to understand nature's mechanisms and to live within their limits. And this, of course, is of vital importance to conservation. It's important to realize that science has two parts. Firstly, the body of knowledge, which most people know about, but don't necessarily understand. And secondly, the method of finding things out. And I believe that one of the big deficiencies in our science education, both formal and informal, is that we don't give enough attention to explaining the scientific method. Because I believe that everyone needs to understand the scientific method if they are to appreciate the full value of science. And the reason I say this is that many conflicts and controversies on major science issues, such as climate change, global warming, sea level rise, food and water security, GM foods, etc., are not necessarily about the facts, but about the methods to reveal and analyze those facts and predict future trends. So we need to place a greater emphasis on understanding the scientific method. Another important point is that unlike the image that many journalists portray about science, that it's authoritarian and top-down, science is in fact not about certainty, stability, and top-down authority. Science is all about doubt, skepticism, constantly questioning the status quo, and always testing alternate ideas to find better solutions and explanations. And it's important to realize in this regard that many of the most significant advances in science are made when the current wisdom is discarded. We don't stand on the shoulders of giants, we actually kick the feet out from under the giants of the past. And this current wisdom is discarded and replaced by a new but still imperfect understanding. And this is often at the interface between disciplines. And we've entered an era of science now where subject specialists are not as much in vogue as generalists who work across disciplines where the most fertile ground is found. So science is not a steady accumulation of knowledge. It tends to advance in pulses. And this is largely because it's an ongoing reaction against prior knowledge and wisdom. And it will always, therefore, be work in progress. And we are at a stage in scientific development where there's a considerable reaction against prior knowledge and wisdom. And we're advancing science in many new directions. In my opinion, the main role of science is to establish the likelihood that a certain prediction is closest to what is observable and measurable. So science is important for many reasons. Firstly, it encourages us to question everything, to constantly question the status quo, free of bias, religion, and politics. In my opinion, it's the only reliable way to truly understand how things work. An important aspect of science is it helps us to determine cause and effect and make accurate predictions. And many examples that we see in politics, people don't seem to understand the relationship between cause and effect. And as a result of this, science helps us to promote evidence-based decision-making, to make good decisions in management of resources and in everyday life. And what is remarkable is how many captains of business, heads of industry, both male and female, who have reached top posts in their field have scientific backgrounds because they are able to make evidence-based decisions. Science, of course, helps us to assess risks. For instance, that the 14 hottest summer on record have all occurred this century, and that's important for conservation. It helps us to solve complex problems, such as poverty, climate change, biodiversity loss, control of infectious diseases, and others, because it brings together different disciplines, different mindsets. But also, science makes us humble. It teaches us to know our roles and responsibilities, to recognize our shortcomings and acknowledge our ignorance. We are only beginning to understand the mechanisms of nature, and we need to recognize that and be humble. A concept that I've developed that I found to be very useful in science and environmental education, I call the education value chain. And it goes from information, which most people have access to now through the internet and various other sources, to knowledge, which is information contextualized in our particular environment. And that it's not enough for people to have knowledge. That knowledge has to be used to make good decisions. In other words, to become wisdom. But the next step is you've got to, as a result of that knowledge and wisdom, develop a changed mindset in response to changing circumstances and ultimately change your behavior. Because unless you go through those two steps, nothing has been achieved. And then finally, you need to become an ambassador for that changed mindset and behavior and influence others to change theirs. Now, Klaus Schwab, the leading economist, has suggested that we are in the fourth industrial revolution. Well, I'm just a retired fisherman and I don't really have the basis to disagree with him, but in fact I do. I think that we are in the first post-industrial revolution, which is characterized by an anti-industrial way of thinking, driven by young people in gig economies, and it's going to give us a chance to drive a bigger and better step in human progress and redress past imbalances, and most specifically to adopt a less materialistic culture and develop a more sustainable way of life. So this first post-industrial revolution, I'm not just playing with words. I believe it requires a major change of mindset and behavior. We have at our disposal new tools and hyperconnectivity unprecedented in human evolution. It's a problem to solve complex global problems and undo the wrongs of the first three industrial revolutions, which resulted in many benefits for humankind, but very few benefits for the other inhabitants of the planet. So what's different about this post-industrial revolution? Firstly, it's characterized by cross-generation collaboration with a lot of involvement by young people, a rapid flow of ideas, new fruitful collaborations, and very important contributions by millennials, and especially by youth in developing continents who are bringing in new ways of thinking. So science today is carried out by a multi-brained, multi-generational, hyper-connected superorganism. So the most complex thing in the universe is the human brain. The only more complex thing in it is the community of human brains. And in addition to that, we have the internet, and we're also linked to the Internet of Things. And this has resulted in a massive, unprecedented group intelligence with the capability of co-creating solutions to the most intractable problems. An example of this post-industrial scientific thinking is how we address the environmental crisis. The dilemma we're in is that the thinking that led us into today's problems will not lead us out of them. We need to unlearn what we learned before and overcome the cultural and economic barriers that were crafted during the first three industrial revolutions using new mindsets. So we're questioning the status quo. We need to recognize that humanity is at the crossroads We are the most numerous large animals ever, and our ability to manipulate the environment is unprecedented. We have far exceeded the planet's ability to compensate for our actions and meet our resource needs. We arose from and survived through a biological process, but we are no longer part of wild nature. We are servants of our machines, trapped in unsustainable urban environments, and we are the first animal to domesticate itself and to lose its ecological niche. We've evolved from hunter-gatherers to pastoralists to shopper industrialists and information fetishists. What we need to strive to do is evolve into the custodians of the biosphere. So the environmental crisis is not due to the spontaneous breakdown of natural ecological processes, but to a series of bad decisions by Homo sapiens. We need to recognize that while we are an integral part of nature and we are a valuable species, but in an ecological sense, not a superior one, that every living thing has a right to live, or at least to struggle to live. And this right is not dependent on its actual or potential use to humans. It's dependent on its ecological role in the broader ecosystem. Our role is to understand and work in harmony with nature and not to conquer it. And conservation is therefore about keeping options open for the future by making good decisions. Now, the Anthropocene extinction event that we're currently in and which we are the cause of gives us an opportunity for the human race to work together on an unprecedented scale in a similar way in which we worked in trying to overcome the COVID crisis. And we need to collaborate in using science to help us soften our environmental impact and to force us to change our mindsets, behavior, and lifestyle. And I'd like to end with a few comments about indigenous knowledge. I think that the Nguni concept of Ubuntu is the kind of custodianship ethic that we need to develop in our approach to the use of natural resources. Ubuntu is difficult to describe in one English word, but it's a combination of respect, concern, compassion, empathy, etc. And a person can be a person only through his or her experience with other persons and the broader environment. And in my various books, I've given many examples of how traditional knowledge has been used to solve problems. Here are beehives being used to repel elephants in Zambia, eye spots on cattle that are being used to reduce lion predation in Botswana, the use of the cyber tracker by Louis Liebenberg to capture the knowledge of sand hunter-gatherers, Dr. Matoni Masindi, who's developed the Itiki drought predictor, which is a combination of indigenous knowledge and science in order to make predictions about farming practices. The Abelobi smartphone app that's being used to manage traditional fisheries based on their knowledge of fishes and fisheries. Henry Furetia in Cameroon, Save the Chicken app, which combines indigenous knowledge and science to manage chickens. And I believe that science and indigenous knowledge are compatible and complementary knowledge systems, that science can learn from the wisdom of IKS and can, for instance, isolate the active ingredients in IKS products and take them to the market. And there are many examples of that, rooibos tea, also honeybush tea, bitter herb Hudia Gordoni, which is a slimming product now sold throughout the world, mosquito repellent candles based on indigenous knowledge developed by the CSIR. And all of these and many others, over 700 others, are described in my Harambee book. And then finally, just to mention that there was this interesting comment made by a UCT scientist back in 2016. I feel alienated from science. Science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off, especially in Africa. Well, I don't agree that science is a product of Western modernity. It's a product of the whole of humankind. But I do agree with her that we don't use enough examples of science and inventions from Africa in our school and university curricula. And I believe there's no such thing as Western science or African science. There's only science. There are African, Western, Islamic, and many other contributions to science, but it is a universal concept to which all humans contribute. So these are just some thoughts that we need to contemplate in defining our place in nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruton. As usual, it's a very thought-provoking talk. I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Ziba.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I wanted to say many thanks to Professor Bruton for that, very good introduction to today's session. I think, I was nodding my head all the way as he was speaking about a number of very, important principles and concepts, that basically underpin science for decision making. And I think I wanted to start perhaps where he ended off by highlighting the fact that we have been involved as part of a body of scientists globally who have been undertaking what we call ecosystem assessments, and basically experts from basically all over the world are nominated through the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to actually synthesize knowledge, not only from scientific literature, but also from indigenous and local knowledge and other knowledge forms to basically inform outcomes of these assessments. And obviously, like as Professor Bruton has also shared, these reports share, basically great concern about, unprecedented biodiversity loss, which, among other things, is linked to accelerated land degradation, decline in human well-being, and is exacerbated by climate change, and what we have now experienced recently, like the strong relationship between biodiversity loss and pandemics. What is key is the fact that basically all of the drivers of biodiversity loss, the direct drivers such as land or sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species, among others, are basically underpinned by the indirect drivers, which are linked to decisions that we as humans make about the use of resources, whether the drivers related to expansive urbanization that is rapid and leads to basically substantial pollution, which when it's not accompanied with development of infrastructure to deal with increased human population in urban areas, technological advances that allow us to exploit resources more, poor institutions and poor governance, as well as conflict and epidemics, all of these things, basically are linked to human decisions and the things that we using science try to understand about, how do they influence, biodiversity, and what are options for decision making in light of these, issues. And I think as a continent, we have very good reasons to be proud about the fact that, we're the only continent with a relatively intact assemblage of its herbivores. But I think one of the things that is very clear is the fact that, as a continent, we have not been spared, by, these declines in biodiversity. I like to share this figure because, in this figure, what you see in the, on the picture is that all the animals in black, have since gone extinct, and all the animals below the line in light green are basically animals that are currently, extinct. And basically, if you look at Africa, basically we're the continent that has lost the lowest number or proportion of its, mega herbivores, and we still have a large number of animals that we have conserved. And I think this is something that we see as a strong basis upon which to build, decision making with regards to policy and interventions and practice to enhance, or reduce biodiversity loss or halt biodiversity loss and enhance outcomes for people in a way that recognizes this interlinkage between people and the environment. The losses that we've seen, are no different in terms of trends from, other parts of the world. If you look, for instance, since the 1970s, biodiversity loss or, the population index reflecting basically, large mammal population declines in Africa shows that we've seen substantial declines from the 70s to current globally. That basically this is estimated at around 80% or 80% since 1970. And I think it's something that as the continent, we need to grapple with in terms of what next to do. If you just look at one species, the lion, basically, since the last 3 decades or so, we've seen significant declines that are basically around 60 to 65%, across many regions or sub-regions in Africa, except for Southern Africa, where the lion population is growing at about 8%. But again, when we talk about this, usually we're just looking at a snapshot in time from the last or so century. But actually, if you look at lion numbers, they've crashed from about 1.2 or so million lions, about 200 or so years ago, to basically the current 30 to 40,000 African lions in the wild. So I think it's very important as well that we actually gain perspective when we're talking about biodiversity loss, that most of the time when we're talking about these losses, we are focusing on the last century, but actually our impact as humans has been quite substantial. If you look at a rhino again, you will see that this is the area shaded in brown or light brown is basically the historical range of both black and white rhino, and the red spots are basically where both black and white rhino currently remain in substantial numbers in the wild. We do obviously have, small populations all over, but, they not represent anything that they used to be, or their distribution does not reflect anything that it used to be even at the turn of the century. Bringing that closer home, in South Africa, we know that rhino poaching, especially of white rhino in Kruger, has been a major driver of the decline in the South African population of rhino, and has been a huge, a region of major concern for us. But one of the things that I think becomes, key is really something that has got to do with the fact that even as we face these challenges, we also face questions about, the science that underpins our ability to estimate rhino populations in large areas such as Kruger National Park. And so often we get questions about how do you know that the population is now at around 2,400, 2,500, when last year you reported this number, and the number of rhinos lost to poaching is this relative to what you're supposed to be having. So for instance, people will say, last year you reported 2,000 rhino, and you said 200 rhino were poached. So why are you now reporting 2,500 rhino? And there's a lot of factors that are at play here. And I think one of the key things that, again, relates to a point that was very well made by Professor Bratton, is about the fact that we used tested methods that are quite reliable, and we basically accept that there will be error that is due to various things, whether it's sampling error or it's error due to observers. And there are also some biases that we account for when we count, or estimate populations in the wild. And these are informed by basic, methodologies that have been developed, by, the scientific community over time. So if I was with you, I would have actually been carrying a big, bag with, chocolates or candy to basically ask you to tell me how many elephants are in this figure. And most of the time we get, widely varied, responses around, the number of elephants that are here. But the point that we use this image to make is the fact that it is very difficult to count elephants in the wild over large expanses of land. For instance, an area like the Kruger National Park is about the size of Wales or Belgium. And you cannot fly and count every elephant in Kruger National Park. So we use, estimates that are informed by, quite, sound science over estimating elephants in wild spaces, considering the fact that sometimes it's very difficult to count them. So basically, in this figure, that's basically the number of animals that are there, like in this figure. But some are completely or partially hidden by the vegetation, and that is basically the challenge that a person who's flying over this area with a fixed wing aircraft, faces when they count elephants on an annual basis. But I think in the interest of time, I will move very quickly and say that I recommend a book by Professor Jane Carruthers called National Park Science, because this book reflects really the evolution of science in national parks from a period where the focus was really on protecting and preservation of biodiversity in protected areas, to a period where there was focus on measuring and monitoring, to a period where now, there's a lot of this integration, synthesis, innovating, and also I think strong influence of globalization or the internationalization of science. And this has had very divergent experiences. But I think overall, over time, we've seen a consolidation of our understanding of our biodiversity in ways that has helped us as a country to manage our biodiversity for positive outcomes. And I think what is key is to really appreciate that, both the seascapes and the landscapes that support, the very diversity that we manage, contribute not only just, to biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, but rather contribute also to our ability to address some of the basic sustainable development goals, such as no poverty, no hunger, good health and well-being, and many others. And I think the emphasis here should be that it's not just about, biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, but it is about that new deal between people and nature that we aim to achieve during, the negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework when we negotiate later on this year. It's key to basically see the synthesis of science and other types of knowledge, including indigenous and local knowledge, from local to national to regional, as well as global level, as critical for decision making, particularly to contributing to what we call bending the curve, meaning basically leading to more nature positive outcomes by hopefully towards the middle of this century. So with that, I want to just really appreciate you and hope that I've been able to share with you some practical examples from a national conservation agency, basically to inform decision, to use science to inform decision making, both at local level but also at global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ziba. That was a very informative talk. Before I go over to Professor Knox, I just want to know, if I counted 5 elephants in the picture, do I get to half a chocolate?
Well, I have to mail it, not unless I can share it with via Zoom with you. I can share a picture of a chocolate with everybody.
Okay, with that, I'm now going to call on Professor Knox.
Thank you very much for the invite. I am
Thank
joining you from Minnesota in the USA, and it is 6:34 in the morning for me here. I'm very happy to be participating in this panel, and I have focused my presentation on work that I do as a medicinal plant scientist, and this talk is based on a study that was conducted as part of a master's study by Casper Duplessis. And my other co-workers are Dr. Gary Stafford, who is now at the University of Pretoria, and Dr. Lisa Philander, whom I'm actually visiting here at the University of Minnesota. So I'm going to talk about how science can really help us in better understanding how we can conserve medicinal plants that are utilized by people. But before I get going, of course, I want to highlight a few things and just to bring us into a context of understanding that South Africa is a very special place. It is a place where we have high levels of biodiversity, and these 3 different biodiversity hotspots, and most likely a 4th on its way. And the areas where I work, the Cape Floristic region, is really world-renowned for 9,000 species that are actually found in this particular area. And of course, the succulent karoo has the largest amount of succulent biodiversity, and it also happens to be a center of many different geophytes that are of interest globally. And many of our plants in South Africa and in other parts of Africa are highly endemic, and they're not found anywhere else in the world. And in the Maputo land, Pondoland, Albany corridor, you have about 1,900 plant endemics that are only really found there. So we do live in a very special place, and any place with such high levels of biodiversity will have that biodiversity being exploited by its people. And so you have plants such as Erythrina that are important as part of the ecosystem in places like Durban. You also have species such as the wild ginger, Saphonocalis aethiopicus, which is regarded as being extinct in the wild in South Africa. And many collections of this particular species are now taking place in places like Mozambique. And interestingly enough, this particular plant has been saved through cultivation. And some of those cultivation practices even include the use of biotechnology, plant tissue culture. So our plants are really quite interesting. And yes, they do face many different threats, such as these quiver trees, which are now said to face the threat of climate change, and their ranges might be changing. Their reproductive systems are quite unknown, and even plants such as the quiver tree have had many use as ethnobotanicals. For example, they get the name quiver tree or kokerboom from the fact that these plants were actually used to make quivers for arrows by the San. So our plants are wonderful, many different species that are of global interest. And I just want to highlight plants such as these tiny little conophytums, which suddenly are facing a threat because they are being extracted from the wild and being taken to other parts of the world in a trade which is somewhat illicit. So we do have a good understanding that society, human society, and plants interact in all kinds of ways. And in terms of African traditional medicines, plants are integral for healing. And the way in which this is communicated is generally through oral histories, where information about plants and their uses is actually passed on from one generation to another. And this is very different if you contrast this to Chinese traditional medicine, where there has been much dedication in terms of recording ways in which plants are used and even ways in which these plants need to be cultivated. So traditional medicines in South Africa are very important to people, and that is largely driven by the fact that you've got more traditional healers than you do Western doctors. And at the same time, this exploitation of traditional medicines is also leading to new herbal products. And I think Prof. Bruton spoke a little bit about this. So there are many connections that connect people and plants. And many of those plants are traded informally and are actually harvested from the wild. This, of course, causes a biodiversity threat. And very little farming of these medicinal plants is happening. Yes, some species such as rooibos are farmed because they feed into large formal markets, and species such as Pelargonium pseudoides that are used to make cough mixtures are also farmed, but that farming is at minute scales. There is still reliance on wild populations. And in the case of Pelargonium, for example, it is the tubers that are extracted, which are then utilized to make herbal products for the informal trade as well as the formal trade. So we have been quite interested in how plants that are found in places such as the Cape Floristic region and the succulent Karoo feed into the indigenous knowledge systems of the Cape bush doctors. So I want to introduce you to the main traders of medicinal plants in the Cape. They are mainly men that base their traditional medicine system on the Khoi and the San identity. And many of these participants have taken on Rastafarianism as a way or lifestyle and religious practice, as well as integrating this into Khoi and San ways of living. And many participants, the Cape bush doctors, feel that they bring into urban centers a history that has largely been lost. So this particular study interacted a semi-structured interview with various different bush doctors that took place in 23 different towns within the Western Cape and some parts of the Northern Cape, which are centers where the bush doctors are very active as the main knowledge holders with regards to medicinal plants. And what was really interesting is that the study used a system of first identifying which ailments the bush doctors are treating, the top 10 ailments, and then we used what is known as use values to then identify the plants that are actually being utilized to treat those particular ailments. And this was a way to project on whether these plants, because many of these plants are extracted from the wild, would be facing some kind of biodiversity threat in terms of their ethnobotanical use. What's interesting here was that plants such as Sutherlandia frutescens or Lycertia frutescens, cancer bush, are being utilized quite heavily. What's interesting also is that Tulbalgia species, wild garlic, are also being utilized fairly heavily. And of course, these plants are being extracted in terms of tubers. Bulbon lactifolia is used, and this is a species that seems to have increasing use, is utilized for a wide range of ailments and has become very popular to treat male-related problems. And many of the other plants are utilized by bush doctors, and it is mainly the foliage that is actually utilized. So we also looked at which plant part was being used, and much of the bush doctor medicine is actually foliage, and thus it is renewable resources that are actually being harvested. But some of these species are being extracted for their tubers, including various pelargoniums, such as Pelargonium triste. So we extended this work by trying to better understand whether the bush doctors would then be willing to cultivate these plants. And also we wanted to understand whether they thought that their practices might ultimately lead to a biodiversity threat. So we asked them for their opinions in terms of what might be leading to declines in medicinally important species, such as Tulbalgia. And many participants acknowledged that in the future, overharvesting might become a problem, and that some practices are not always conservative. Some people even indicated that the way in which they harvest is quite important. So, for example, if you harvest a bulb, you break off a little piece, and then you return the heart of that bulb back into the soil. But because they might be harvesting in conservation areas, they might be harvesting at night, and they might not have many opportunities to harvest. Younger generations seem to be harvesting greater amounts of material, and they foresee this as likely leading to a problem. They also acknowledge that climate change is a potential issue, and the fact that many of the lands have been turned for agriculture and urban developments are increasing in the Cape areas. And this, of course, is also leading to biodiversity losses. And what has been acknowledged scientifically as the main drivers of the decline of biodiversity have been climate change, agricultural expansion, urban developments, as well as invasive species. Those are currently recognized as the main drivers of biodiversity loss in terms of South African biodiversity. So many bush doctors acknowledge that they would be quite willing to utilize cultivation as a way to prevent or secure important plant medicinal species for future purposes. And 52% of the bush doctors were willing to participate in cultivation or were cultivating plants, and 27 species were actually grown already at home for use. And what was very interesting was that plants such as Tulbalgia were among the top species that were grown, and this, of course, is also linked to the plants that were showing up as very high in the use value. And species such as Sutherlandia were also being grown. And again, I bring you attention to Bulbine latifolia, which is one of those species that had a very high use value. So bush doctors do acknowledge that wild harvesting is problematic and cultivation can be used as a conservation strategy, but they still rely on wild populations in order to meet market demands because they do not necessarily have the land to cultivate plants at high levels. And so one of the interests would be to generate large amounts of materials through cultivation, but they are really interested in using organic practices that are in alignment with their philosophies. And so using permaculture strategies, for example, biodynamic strategies for cultivation, and even what they term as botanical ranching, where you cultivate plants amongst other wild plants. So you set up a system that is more reflective of what nature would give to them if they collect plants from the wild. And so many bush doctors foresaw the lack of capital as well as land as an impingement in their possibility of using cultivation as a conservation strategy. Many others said that they didn't necessarily have the right educational tools to be able to set up practices that would be economically viable, as well as assisting in providing enough materials to drive a conservation through cultivation strategy as a means to preserve medicinal plants. And so I just want to finish this off by saying that being able to participate in research initiatives that directly align with the interests of Indigenous knowledge holders actually holds a lot of value. And this might be a way to reimagine the way in which we conserve medicinal plants. In this particular study, we included the opinions of the bush doctors and have been actually participating in long-term projects to better understand their needs and to then also set up initiatives where we are using various scientific practices. And one of those projects is actually a study where we've been conducting on Dodonea viscosa, where we actually are setting up in my particular laboratory practices that would allow for cultivation of this particular species, which would then ultimately be commercialized by the bush doctors. And we did a study that used a biodynamic protocol in a biodynamic farm, a wine farm, and this solved two problems. This solved the problem of generating scientific knowledge in order to be able to cultivate the species at large scale, and then it also solved the problem of access to land for the bush doctors, because now they can grow medicinal plants at this biodynamic farm, which has patches of natural fynbos, and they can utilize their own philosophies and means and actually generate plants that they can then commercialize. So I hope with that, I've generated some interest in terms of utilizing cultivation as a conservation strategy and integrating ideas that are linked to Indigenous knowledge holders. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'd like to thank the bush doctors for the work that I do with them, as well as Gary Stafford, Lisa Philander, and Casper Duplessis, who participated in the study.
Thank you so much, Professor Knox. That was a very interesting talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers, and thank you, Aisha, for hosting with me. So now it's time for the Q&A. You're welcome to write your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the reaction button at the bottom. It says reactions and there's a smiley face, and you can just use the raise hand function if you wish to ask the question yourself. You can either switch on your camera and your mic or do whatever is comfortable for you so that we can get the discussion going. So just to start, I just wanted to thank each of the speakers for bringing in, the question, why is science important, in a variety of ways, but it actually worked out because it was like a funnel approach where Professor Bruton was able to speak about science holistically, and Dr. Ziba was able to speak about it from a global to local level, especially with regards to, elephant and lion populations within South Africa and across the continent. And Professor Knox was able to bring us, to a case study about the medicinal plants that are used by the Rasta communities. I had a question actually for all of you, just to get things kicking, and while other people are thinking of questions to ask, especially probably for you, Professor Knox, but feel free, Professor Bruton, if you want to come in and answer this question. I was wondering, how can we ensure that Indigenous knowledge, especially the science of their knowledge, is protected once their products are formalized and sold commercially?
That's a very interesting question. And in terms of the South African system, there there's ways actually that and legislation that is already assisting with the protection of Indigenous knowledge. So one of the aspects that one has to take into consideration at any stage whilst bioprospecting is to actually declare that you are bioprospecting, and you do this to the Department of Environmental, Forestry and Fisheries. And you have to fill out a pre-phase or first phase discovery notification, and you indicate which plants you're working on and how the quantities and who the knowledge holder actually happens to be. Because at the end of the day, the Biodiversity Act and the Benefit Sharing Acts indicate that the NEMBA Act indicates that you have to share those benefits with the original knowledge holder. And at the same time, if one is working in an ethical consideration, if you are told information that is regarded as a trade secret by the Rastafarian bush doctors or by Xhosa healers or sangomas, you actually need to make sure that you don't divulge that information. There are also processes of digitization of Indigenous knowledge, and where information is sensitive, this can then get locked, and the people that have access to it would then be those that are privy to that information. So there are ways of protecting the information, there are ways of sharing the benefits, and South Africa has the Biodiversity Act. There's also the Nagoya Protocol, which is a global protocol that assists with the protection of genetic resources as well as Indigenous knowledge.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for your talk. Professor Bruton, would you like to respond or react to that?
Yes, yeah, Professor Makonga is really the expert on this, but I have a few views. Firstly, I think we need to increase awareness of the importance of Indigenous knowledge, and we're, very appropriately, a number of centres of excellence in Indigenous knowledge have been established at South African universities. There's a particularly active one at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, with which I've collaborated in my own research and writing. Unfortunately, the one at the University of Northwest was burnt down, but I think it is being re-established. And then in terms of sharing benefits, I think South Africa is actually a world leader in sharing the benefits of some IKS products with the people from whose knowledge they were developed. And in particular, with respect to rooibos tea and other rooibos products, and also Lipia japonica, the mosquito repellent. I happen to have a particular interest in an different aspect of Indigenous knowledge, and that is the design, construction, and use of traditional fishing methods, on which I've published throughout Africa. And these methods are very important for us to conserve because they tend to harvest aquatic resources in a sustainable way, in contrast to so-called modern gear, which harvest resources to extinction, which is much to the detriment of the people who are dependent on that resource. So when one thinks of the Isifonia thrust basket drives on the Pongola River floodplain, the valve traps at the Cozy system, the tidal fish traps both on our marine coast and on the Orange River, all of these need to be recognized, and we need to put as much effort into conserving them as to conserving the fishes that they call catching and the other aquatic life. So, we need to, in our writing about African and South African innovation, include examples of IKS, and these should also be included in the formal curricula at schools and universities.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that as well. And part of the themes that were flowing from each of your discussions was about information and education, especially when it comes to making key decisions within where natural resources apply. And I think this is quite important, especially within our education systems, from the primary level to tertiary level. Professor Bruton, you spoke about this in terms of the youth, how important the youth and the millennials were during the, I think you said the first industrial revolution. I wrote it down. But you mentioned this during your talk. And I don't want to take up the floor. So do we have any questions from the room? I have one from Johan Kruger here. He's asking, where do you feel science can improve in face of global challenges, such as climate change? We can start with you, Professor Makunga.
I think there are many different places where science fits. You know, I did mention the study on the quiver trees, and this is actually being conducted by Prof. Guy Midgley and his group. And you know, that particular study is trying to understand what's actually happening with the quiver trees, what's happening with their reproduction systems, what's happening with the seed bank, and how this can be ultimately affected by climate change, because already they're seeing, you know, declines in the amount of flowering of these plants, in the establishment of seed banks for this particular species. And so, you know, the role of scientists is pretty much in every aspect, in trying to understand what is happening now, and then trying to understand what might potentially happen, and also observing if there's ways in which we can circumvent impacts of climate change for future generations. There are probably many other examples that we could put into place. Another project that I just want to bring on is impacts of climate change on sea grasses. You know, this is something that is also very interesting, and we are actually trying to understand this from a genetic perspective in our department with Professor Sophie van der Heyden. And then in my lab, we're trying to see if we can actually develop tissue culture systems that may actually assist in replenishing seagrass populations that might potentially be affected by climate change. The examples are numerous. I think pretty much in every aspect in relation to climate change, science is required.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I see the hand from the UFS, but I'll let Professor Bruton respond or react to the question. Just to remind you, which is, how do you feel science can improve in face of global challenges?
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that science is the major tool that we have, not only to determine the extent of climate change, but also its impact and the development of ways of mitigating the impacts of climate change. It's our main tool. Without science, we cannot define the problem and we cannot solve the problem. And we need to remember that climate change is already happening. We already are experiencing more frequent and more severe weather events, which are impacting nations throughout the world. So we're not only looking at mitigating the impact, we're also looking at adapting to the impacts of climate change. And I mean, there are entire nations, for instance, low-lying Pacific Islands, where an entire nation is threatened. And reminds me of a recent story, which apparently is true, of a rather tall World Wildlife Fund official who visited one of these Pacific Islands. And he met the governor at the airport, and he asked the governor, which is the highest point on your island? And the governor looked at him and said, "You are, sir." And Australia has actually set aside land for some Pacific Island nations to eventually settle in when their islands get flooded. So this is happening now. It's incredibly urgent, and we need to address it. Coral bleaching is another one. You know, we terrestrial animals, we don't tend to pay enough attention to what's happening under the ocean. We tend to forget that 95% of the habitable volume of our planet is under the oceans. Coral bleaching is going to have a massive effect on not only marine biodiversity, but on essential ecological processes and life support systems that originate in the oceans.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. And thank you, Professor Makunga, as well. Just to move on to the question from the student from UFS, please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Samantha. It's just to everybody. We have a challenge today, so we are currently scattered in the department. We're not at the nice classroom that we started with. My question is to Mike, and it's a little bit of a devil's advocate as well. I mean, we've been, and you've done it all. I mean, you had your whole entire career in hardcore science, and then you also ventured over to reaching out to the public. But what are we doing wrong? That we're not reaching enough people and to get the science connected to the general public so that everybody understands what we're doing, and a lot of the time is not frowned upon on what we are doing in science. I sometimes get the feeling we are missing the boat.
Oh, thanks, Liesl. Great to see you again. I think the biggest mistake that we're making is that we're constantly preaching to the converted. Science educators are talking to people who are interested in science. And there's a massive fraction of the population that is turned off by science because it's too technical. They regard it as too difficult to understand, and they don't listen to the voice of science. So what I think we've got to do is be far more imaginative in the way in which we reach the entire population. And I've been working on this in a number of ways. For instance, I work with a professional actor, David Muller, and he and I produced 10 science theatre productions, which convey important scientific messages, but through entertaining science theatre. Also, Nicholas Ellenborg and I have worked together in this regard. And I'm currently working with an art impresario, Dirk Dernez, who has a stable of artists who address themes such as biodiversity, conservation, climate change, sea level rise through their artworks. And in that way, we reach that section of the population which doesn't listen to the voice of science, but is very interested in art. And in my latest book, I mentioned a number of singers, musicians, dancers, and others throughout Africa who are using their medium to reach the public about critical science and medical issues.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. We have a similar question from Charles Luchagula in the chat. So I'll just read out his question because it's similar to Professor Liesl's question. He's saying, our scientific knowledge has been progressing, yet species are becoming extinct at an alarming rate. So what is it that we are not doing correct? It's quite similar to the previous question, but I'll let you go ahead and react or respond, Professor Makunga. Thank you.
I think science communication is really important, and you know, we need to have more conversations with people about science in public debate, and also not only be the ones that are just out there to pour our knowledge, but to actually listen to their concerns so that we are able to address them. So I think it is exceedingly important. And the way that I see this is we actually need to target, you know, youth at the very earliest. We should be talking about conservation to toddlers and, at preschool level, because by the time you get to matric or going into university, it's actually too late. This should be our concern, when kids are still very young, so that they can actually appreciate nature and be wanting to take care of the planet. So I think science communication at all the different levels is really important. And I think often our voice is not loud enough. And I say this because, there was so much pseudoscience with regards to this pandemic. There were WhatsApp messages that were flowing all over the show. Yeah. And we as scientists were just not participating in the same way as the people that were, sending out these rather incorrect messages. So we also need to have the courage and be much more boisterous in our approach in actually spreading our message. I think we have a tendency to be too quiet, too shy. We're not using the modes that are popular in actually sending out our messages, social media, TikToks.
Yeah.
And we really need to engage with this much, much, much more.
Thank you so much for your responses, and I absolutely agree. Oh, did you want to respond, Professor Britton?
Yes, if I could make 2 points. Firstly, okay. I agree that scientists are not outspoken enough, and I don't think our scientific umbrella bodies are outspoken enough and enough in the public domain, issuing press releases, sending policy statements to government, etc., and being more active in communicating what's going on. Because what's happened with social media is that the pseudo and anti-science lobbies have used it as a kind of megaphone. So they get a disproportionate amount of attention, even though they are radical groups at the ends of the bell curve. So scientists need to be in the forefront, of communicating the seriousness of the situation. The second point I'd like to make is that we need to recognize that the way in which conservation is practiced today is completely different from the past. It's very important what Dr. Aziba talked about, the role of conservationists in formally protected areas, looking after the charismatic mega herbivores like elephants and giraffes and rhinos and so on. But it's equally important that everyday citizens, us people who live in cities, recognize that we are the conservationists of the future, because climate change is mainly being caused by activities in cities. And unless we change our lifestyles and industrialists change the way in which they use resources and emit emissions and so on, we're not going to address the cause, and we're only going to be dealing with the effect. So, we need to recognize that conservation today is a two-pronged approach, formal conservationists in protected areas, and then all the other people who live outside the protected areas, especially in cities, who have a massive role to play by changing their lifestyles.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for both your responses. And just to summarize, it's about the dissemination of information to a various or a wider audience, which is absolutely very important. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, so I want to get to them. Adam Enyang says, how can we build synergy amongst modern science for the development of the medicinal plants cultivation, management, and use with the traditional knowledge in Africa, e.g. Western Africa and the rest of the continent? I'll address this to you, Professor Makunga, and then Professor Bruton, you can respond.
I think this actually needs a whole body of different persons to actually work on this. So it has to be, transdisciplinary. It can't just be ethnopharmacologists that are working and natural product chemists that are working. You also need people to be able to study medicinal plants as agricultural crops. And often this information is not necessarily available because they've never really been grown as, medicinal crop products. And at the same time, you also need to maybe even integrate social scientists that are delving in medical anthropology. You need people that are involved in economics to be able to understand the value chain of actually developing something from an indigenous knowledge-based product to a product that's actually translated via a scientific verification method into even maybe a patentable product that's actually sold. So you need a whole body of different people. I mentioned patents. That means that you got to have people that understand intellectual property. So it takes a whole suite of different expertise and not just necessarily scientific expertise. And that's not necessarily easy, especially if one is trying to develop a product that will be able to fit into a global space, because you might require, clinical trials, and that, of course, gets into some seriously expensive business.
Thank you for your response, Professor Makonga. Professor Bruton, go ahead.
Firstly, I'd like to thank Prof. Makonga for the word ethnopharmacology. I collect words ending in ology, and that's a new addition to my list. But something that I've written quite a lot about is how smartphone technology has enabled people with traditional knowledge to liaise with scientists and to combine their two knowledge systems into a knowledge system that both can use and gain benefit from. And I mentioned Henry Fauretio, who created the smartphone app called Save the Chicken. And basically, he and his fellow rural chicken farmers in Cameroon have pooled their knowledge gained from generations of observation and trial and error with science, and combined a database that allows them to optimize the efficiency of their chicken farms. And this is happening in many different fields, and it's facilitated through the connectivity provide and the ability to transmit data and images to one another using smartphones.
Thank you for the response, Professor Bruton. We have another question in the chat. Sangale Lengoiboni, sorry if I didn't say your name correctly, asked a number of questions, so feel free to answer either of them or all of them. And it reads, how are communities who are custodians of traditional knowledge reacting to science? Are they receptive? Also, do scientists work to accommodate indigenous knowledge in conservation? Professor Bruton, do you want to?
I think a lot more can be done. More scientists need to include indigenous knowledge in their investigations and in contextualizing their scientific discoveries. But I believe South Africa is a leader in that field, and we need to encourage it more, both in South Africa and in other African countries. It's a very fertile ground for further research and collaboration.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Makonga, go ahead. Thank you.
This is a wonderful question, and it's exceedingly important to be able to gain trust of local communities, especially if you are interested in understanding their traditional knowledge. And there are ways in which you are able to gain respect from them, and it often requires a lot of relationship building. You know, you can't just arrive in a village and go, hey, I'm a scientist. I'm here to gather your knowledge, give it all to me. Because often people are skeptical, you know, how are you going to use their knowledge? Are you going to make money out of their knowledge? So you need to be very clear of what your intentions are and also outline to them how they're going to benefit. And if there is no benefit to them, you need to be honest about that. So I think honesty and ethical practice ultimately leads to people being more receptive when scientists go into their communities. And I think it's very, yeah.
Sorry.
And I just wanted to address the second part. How do scientists work to accommodate Indigenous knowledge? I think it's very important to accommodate Indigenous knowledge because Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practices is often very conservative in its mode of action. And I think Prof. Bruton indicated this. It's through modernization that we've actually become exceedingly less conservative in the way in which we approach things. You know, people would, for example, only harvest a medicinal plant at certain times of the year. So when plants are flowering, they would never touch it because they would understand that this would affect the life history of that particular species. Or as I mentioned before, you have practices of chopping off a little bit of the bulb and then returning much of that bulb. But because we now live in quite a hard-pressed type of lifestyle, and often people that actually have Indigenous knowledge are not necessarily the ones that are actually collecting medicinal plants. You have, you know, collectors who just go there and collect, and they are acting in a very non-conservative way, and they're more interested in their livelihood. So we need to be able to understand, you know, differences amongst different bodies of people that might be interacting with traditional knowledge and exploiting Indigenous knowledge systems.
Thank you, Professor Makunga. Professor Bruton, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, if I may give two very different examples of the interface between Indigenous knowledge and science. A colleague of mine from Germany, Professor Hans Fricker, was researching the coelacanth, that famous living fossil fish in the Comores. And he took a very expensive research submersible to the Comores and spent several weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars during the day searching for coelacanths off Grand Comore Island. And they found none. They then met with the traditional fishermen who caught coelacanths, who laughed at them and said, why are you looking during the day? Coelacanths rest during the day and they hunt at night. So Hans went back into the water the following night in his submersible, and within a few hours discovered coelacanths. Another example is two biologists who were visiting a game reserve and had a particular interest in distilling gin. They noticed that infusions made from elephant dung were used by local people to create healthy drinks. And they realized that elephants eat over 100 different plants, and that about 70% of the plant matter that they ingest is not actually digested. It appears in the dung undigested. So they decided to use the botanicals in elephant dung to flavor their gin. And they've created a very successful commercial product called Ndlovu gin, which you can now buy in liquor stores, which is gin flavored with elephant dung.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for those responses. We have two more questions in the chat. The first one is from Charles. who asks, which may be a better approach towards conservation between applying our scientific knowledge to manage protected areas, or let nature take its own course, e.g. using strict nature reserves? Professor Makunga, do you want to go ahead?
There has been a shift in the way of thinking of policing conservation, because sometimes it just doesn't work. You know, people will often say that we have always had access to these plants, we have always had access to this land. We don't understand now why we are, you know, being told that we can't access that land anymore. And I think the one way of actually dealing with this is to actually incorporate local communities and make them participate in conservation. So, for example, one could set up a project in a reserve where, you know, Cape Bush doctors are allowed to go and collect plants there, but then they monitor the recovery of these plants, and they become part of a conservation project. I think the role of citizen scientists, this was mentioned by Claudia Roth in the chat, is also very important. And that is, you know, the general public pretty much assisting with different projects that are associated with nature. So I don't think we should be, you know, divorcing nature reserves and conservation from each other and people. Instead, I think we should be integrating different players, because the moment you become strict, people are going to go in there at night, and they will then, you know, collect much more than what they actually need, because they know that they can't get back in there. So we have to really view conservation, the exploitation of nature, natural resources, using a slightly different lens. And I think one example is the exploitation of forest species for medicinal purposes. And Prof. Kurt Geldenhuys has actually shown that forests are able to actually recover from anthropogenic uses. And so perhaps the idea of actually letting people to go and harvest is not such a bad one. Obviously, you know, ring barking is not great, but, you know, maybe stripping stripping of bark is a better way of actually doing this. So I don't necessarily think that being strict becomes very useful, because people will find a way to get into a nature reserve.
And I also think that talks to, you know, so the marriage between social sciences and what they call natural sciences. Professor Bruton?
Yeah, you know, South Africa has an excellent record of establishing formal conservation areas on land and in the sea. But the reality is our formal game reserves are not big enough, you know, to accommodate the home ranges, especially of large migratory animals. And they tend to be surrounded by fences. So we have to manage those spaces, although there is a tendency now to take down fences between conservation areas to make migrations more possible. But what is happening is that we're recognizing the importance of informal corridors between formal protected areas, and even what's called biodiversity stepping stones. And these are parks and indigenous gardens within cities that act as stepping stones for wildlife to move from one place to another. For instance, I have in my garden an eco pool, and it's amazing the visitors that I have. I had 2 yellow-billed ducks arrive and spend 6 hours foraging in my pool the other day, obviously en route to somewhere. Kingfishers and various aquatic insects come past. So, we need to bridge the gaps between our conservation areas with these informal corridors and stepping stones.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses. And I think there is an involvement of the human element anyway within protected areas or around nature reserves. And it may be difficult to completely remove the involvement of local communities or indigenous communities in these spaces, especially where traditional knowledge and resource use is concerned, as has been discussed during this talk. So our last question from Ahmed Imamu is, in Africa, medicinal plants are used for treatment. What do you advise on it, and how can we integrate it with modern medication?
I think I'm going to be quite short with the answer to this particular question. And, we are utilizing medicinal plants pretty much all the time. And these two different systems are interacting with each other continuously. Mm-hmm. So rooibos, we drink it as a tea, but on the other hand, it actually has medicinal value. And then often people will take Artemisia afra, and if they have a cold, but then they might also take, a pill. So I think there's a continuous interaction of the utilization of medicinal plants together with modern medicines all the time. Mm-hmm. And we need to be able to study, drug-herb interactions. This is something that I think is important. And at the same time, traditional medicines have been very important in actually giving us many different chemical entities that have actually led to what is commercially available. So traditional medicine actually often leads to, pharmaceutical products, whether they are going into the plant pharmaceutical space or they're actually going into the, sort of modernized Western pharmaceutical space.
Thank you for your response. Professor Britton, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think we need to recognize that in all fields of endeavor, there are genuine practitioners, as in many herbal medicine people, and there are also fake practitioners. And unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic, we had examples in Madagascar and Tanzania, where the presidents of those countries were promoting so-called herbal remedies for coronavirus, which was simply not effective and probably cost those countries dearly in terms of human lives and human livelihoods. So we need to recognize that, some remedies work, but some don't, and we need to know the difference.
Thank you so much for your responses. And thank you so much for all the questions. I've just seen one new question in the chat. I'm not sure if you are up to answer one more question. Is that okay?
I will answer one last question, and then unfortunately I actually have to go because I need to now start my day at the university.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. And the question, I'll read just the question from Murphy Tladi. How can we ensure that distribution of scientific information is safe? I think it's a good end to this discussion, but please go ahead.
I think it's important to have accurate information that has empirical evidence, and information that has been scientifically validated rather than that is anecdotal. So that is exceedingly important. And I see Murphy Tladi also indicated that devil's claw, for example, is being over-harvested because of the scientific information that's associated with it. But the one way of dealing with this is to actually establish devil's claw as an agricultural crop, so that you have enough plants to feed into the markets that are actually requiring this. It is possible to grow devil's claw. And I know in places like Namibia, there's some farming operations that are actually taking place.
Thank you. And Professor Burton?
Yes, I agree that it's very important that products and services need to be scientifically validated, but there are many vehicles for doing that. And I think a wonderful one is the conversation, which is a series of blogs and newsletters, which is accessible to everyone and accepts abstracts from peer-reviewed scientific publications and disseminates them in an understandable way to lay people.
Thank you so much for your responses. Thank you all for your questions and for your time. Thank you so much to our speakers for taking the time out to speak with us. We really appreciate the knowledge that you've been sharing with us and your expertise. So I'd like to close the meeting now. And all the best in your day today, Professor Makunga. And thank you so much, Professor Britton, for joining us. And thank you to everyone. Please feel free to share the YouTube link for this talk with your colleagues and friends, which will be available on the Share Screen Africa website and on YouTube. Otherwise, have a great afternoon and see you all soon. Thank you.